I believe that every industry, every company, every activity within a company needs to figure out how much change, how much unpredictability is there in their activities, and then set the right amount of agility to match with that. If you're going to do Agile, you need to approach it as a long-term triathlon or marathon. The idea is not to fail fast. The idea is to learn fast. What we're trying to do is to change the cultural speed limits. The first job is you have to create customers that are interested in this innovation. You have to solve an important need for customers, and therefore there need to be metrics about customers. I've got good ideas, but nobody ever listens to me. Nobody ever cares about me. Well, in Agile, we do.
Hello and welcome back, everyone. This is our third episode of interviewing Darrell Rigby about his book, Doing Agile Right. This time I also have it with me here. It's an excellent book, and in the very first episode, we didn't go even beyond the introduction because we had so much to talk about. And then in the last episode, in the second one, we covered chapter 1 and chapter 2. And today's focus will definitely be on chapter 3, how agile do you want to be? And if we make it in time, also in chapter 4, which is agile leadership. So Darrell, welcome back to our show. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, it's great to be here. As you know, one of the things we stress in the book is if you're not having fun, you're not doing Agile right. And so the fact that we're having enough fun that we barely get into the material, I think that's a good thing, nothing bad.
That's a good thing. And I also take it as a good thing that you always show up for our conversations and are willing to take up another one with me. So I guess you're having fun, and that means a lot to me. Now, Darrell, we ended our last episode where you spoke about that there is probably a difference between an accounting unit in an organization and a unit where they actually build like rocket ships, right? Probably referring to companies the like of Blue Origin or SpaceX, etc. Now, chapter 3 is named How Agile Do You Want to Be? And I think this is a really good segue that we had from our last episode to this one. Now, this particular chapter, you start with a story of a person named Mark Allen who wants to run an Ironman. Now, help me connect. I mean, I read the book, so I know it, but our listeners probably don't. Help me connect how the desire of a person who wants to run an Ironman is connected to the question of how agile do you want to be?
It's a reasonable question. And my main point is that if you're going to do Agile, you need to approach it as a long-term triathlon or marathon. We talk so much about sprints, and clearly sprints are an important part of the way you work, but you've got to set a pace that you know you can sustain over the long term, because what we're trying to do is to change the cultural speed limits in an organization, let the organization see what it's capable of doing, but not work so hard that you're burning people out. I see too many executives coming out lately and talking about, if you're not going to work 80-hour weeks, well, then get out of this company. And I don't think that's consistent with Agile principles. What we're trying to do is to make work more enjoyable, more fulfilling, more sustainable for the employees as well as all other stakeholders. And so it does not mean exhausting the organization. And furthermore, frankly, I'm a little tired of the term transformation. The number of clients that I work with that'll go through 3 or 4 different transformations in a year. I think if you're doing Agile right, you're going to avoid doing 3 transformations every year. You're going to adapt. You're going to change. You're going to do it in a natural, evolutionary way that avoids these big bang transformations that I think are exhausting organizations.
Yeah. So, lots to unpack here. Lots to unpack here. Now, I agree, especially with the long-term approach and doing it in a sustainable pace. Now, if I remember correctly, you make a segue from Mark Allen's story, saying that, I mean, he was focused on his heart rate and all of that in order to build up the endurance and strength and all of that to be able to manage the Ironman. Now, you say there's something similar to the heart rate that every organization needs to be aware of, an optimal level of change. Let's explore this concept of an optimal level of change. And I think if I look at it just now again, just for a second, you call it the Agile golden mean as well. Now, what is the optimal level of change? What is this Agile golden mean that you refer to? Obviously, you and your co-authors.
So obviously the golden mean is a term that I borrowed from Aristotle, and I believe it, actually. I do believe in balance in almost everything, that in everything that's important, there's a natural tension, centralization versus decentralization, stress, bad stress versus good stress. And I think Aristotle got it right. And similarly, I think that with Agile, there's a pace that is measurable. You can, at Bain, we do this all the time with our case teams. We survey our case teams every week, no more than every 2 weeks, to ask them, are you creating value for your clients? Are you working in a way that is fulfilling for you and that is sustainable for you? What feedback do you have? And so I'm a believer in setting up metrics, feedback mechanisms to constantly check with people and say, how are you doing? Do you need some help? And, Agile teams do this daily in a huddle where they say, look, I'm a little swamped. Does anybody have any time to help me today? So for me, it's about teamwork. It's about pitching in to help people when you've got a little bit of spare time. It's about following the golden mean. It's about following the golden rule, for that matter, of treating other people respectfully. And I believe it's very easy to collect feedback on that. And part of what makes Agile work is helping people to understand that we value their opinions. We want their feedback. So many frontline workers just feel like, I've got good ideas, but nobody ever listens to me. Nobody ever cares about me. Well, in Agile, we do. We want to know from the people that are engaged in the work, facing customers day to day, how are we doing? Are we making progress at the right pace?
So you mentioned this natural tension in almost everything, centralized, decentralized decisions, all of that. Now, in the book, if I remember correctly, there are several graphs that you show that for different organizations, that Agile golden mean could be in a different place. And this is exactly the title of the chapter, like, how agile do you want to be? Because probably not for every organization, the answer is the same. Now, how do you identify that golden mean for a certain organization? What are the things that you look for?
So it starts with the company's strategy and what is its position? Where is it playing? Is it in an industry that is dynamic and changing frequently, constantly? Are competitors changing? Are suppliers changing? Are customer needs changing? And in a situation like that, you're likely to need more agility. You're likely to have to be changing more frequently. There are other industries or there are other activities within a company that maybe aren't changing altogether that quickly. And remember that Agile is most effective where what you're trying to develop and how you're going to develop it are hard to predict. If it's easy to predict and all you're doing is accomplishing it, then you may not need to set up an Agile team to do that. You already know what you're going to do. You already know how to do it. You just need to do it. And so Agile teams, I think some executives would look at an Agile team and say, well, it's not terribly efficient if you already know what you need to do. And that's true, to tell you the truth. If you already know what you need to do, maybe you don't need to spend all of that time understanding customer needs and building cross-functional teams and setting up huddles or stand-up meetings in the morning and developing hypotheses and testing those hypotheses. If you don't need to do it, then why do it? It's just going to waste time and annoy the teams. So I believe that every industry, every company, every activity within a company needs to figure out how much change, how much unpredictability is there in their activities, and then set the right amount of agility to match with that.
I mean, you probably also don't need to prioritize your backlog if you know that you need all of it anyway, right?
Exactly.
So it's also then about doing some kind of cost-benefit analysis. Because if we think about changing our way of working, every change has its costs. Now, before I get to the costs piece, from the very first answer that you gave me, I noted down a few things. And one of those things was, you mentioned we want to change the cultural speed limits. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think most organizations move far too slowly. And that's not just my personal opinion. When I talk to chief executives, what they talk about is, I'm just shocked that it takes us so long to get things done. And I understand that. And so I think that's part of what leads executives. I think it's misguided, but it leads executives to say, well, the only way I know to go faster is to get people working 80 hours a week instead of 40 hours a week. Well, that's wrong, to tell you the truth. It's just wrong. If you look at, we call it flow in Agile, but if you look at the flow or the cycle times of activities on a traditional team, it's interesting that only 15 to 20% of a traditional team's time is actually spent working. That says 80 to 80 plus percent of the time is actually waiting around for somebody else to do something. Either it's to approve a budget, or it's to get the right people on the team, or it's to get legal approval to do something, or it's to process a capital investment. Whatever it is, they're waiting on somebody else. I just had this conversation with a very impressive CEO a couple of weeks ago where I was saying, if you want to accelerate the speed of your organization, stop all of the wait time. Figure out what are they waiting on, and you as the CEO can break those barriers. You're the one that can go to somebody and say, I'm told that your department is slowing the progress of this team. But I don't want to blame it on the department. You're the head of the department. You're the one that is responsible. It's you I'm holding accountable for slowing down the speed limit of this team. What is slowing it, and what can we do to eliminate that? If you can just raise the work time to wait time ratio by 10%, 20%, 30%, imagine how much faster you can get your tests out into the market. And so my point is kill the wait time, not the employees that are already working their brains out to develop things. Stop the wait time and you can accelerate profitable progress.
Yeah. So we'll probably talk about that when we get to the topic of agile leadership. But there's a great story in the book Built. I don't know whether you read it, by Tony Fadell, where he talks about what Steve Jobs did in terms of pushing the pace of innovation with regards to the iPod. And it goes the following, that Tony Fadell needed resources, but all the other executives or managers didn't want to give him resources because they were focused on Mac development or software development. And he goes to Steve Jobs and complains. And of course, what does Steve Jobs do? He grabs the phone, he calls the person and says, "You're slowing things down," right? Just as you mentioned, Darrell. And of course, nobody else wanted to get those phone calls. So Tony would get all of the resources he needed to ultimately make both the iPod and then later the iPhone a huge success. And I think that's really important, that executives, senior leaders, understand that they have a crucial role to play. But as I mentioned, we'll get there with regards to the topic of agile leadership.
Yeah, Sohrab, you make another important point that I just want to build on before we move off of it, which is the importance of focused resources on agile initiatives. Because the agile employee, we've done a lot of research on this, the average employee is working on 3.5 to 4 projects at any given time. 3.5 to 4 things at any given time. We know that that's not how the human brain works. We do not multitask well. Multitasking makes us stupid. It's just that clear. So what happens when somebody at Apple or any other company says, "I need these people," and other people in the organization won't give them up? Well, we know what happens. They won't give them up, so all we do is add another task to people's time, to people's schedule. And it's almost invisible, if you're not careful, to see the costs that creates for a team and for the organization as a whole. But every time you add another task, it increases the time to market by another 20%. And so one of the reasons that we work so hard to get 100% or at least 80% focused team members on a team is to avoid this very problem. Because if somebody comes to us and says, "Well, you can't have this person because they're already working on 5 tasks," I know I've got a roadblock. I know I've got a block. So why in the world do you have anyone working on 5 tasks? You need more talent on this capability. The problem is, let's get more talent in this area. Let's not spread this person across 2 more tasks. It's really bad for an organization.
Or reduce the number of initiatives that we're working on at the same time, right?
It's a good point. Yeah.
Prioritization, right? But
and you make a great point, because typically when we go into an organization, we find that there are at least 30% of the existing projects that if they were to stop, nobody would really care. In fact, most people know that they're zombie projects anyway. They're just the walking dead. They're not going to create any value for the organization. So you're absolutely right. There's typically 30% of the activities that could stop whenever the organization decides to do it.
That's one. And I mean, if you manage to get more flow, if you manage to get more productivity, even the projects that you stop today, because you manage to finish all the others faster, you also get these done fast. I mean, there's so much research about the topic that you just mentioned, especially by Gerald Weinberg, where you see that having 3 to 4 projects results in 30 to 50% productivity drop on an individual level. And that obviously adds up to the organizational level. And there's also so many organizations that, if you look at Amazon, deeply value things like single-threaded teams. I mean, why would they do that? I mean, they have probably more money than most organizations in the world, but they still say, no, 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 no. We need to be really, really, really focused. And if we're not focused, I love this quote from them. The best way to make a project fail is to make it someone's part-time job. It says it all, but we'll get there. The other topic from the very beginning that caught my attention, Darrell, is you mentioned that you're tired of the term transformation because so many of the companies you interact with, so many of your clients, go through transformations multiple times a year. And you're tired of seeing that. You don't want that. If they do Agile right and do an Agile transformation the right way, they wouldn't be doing that. Now, what are some of the main points that you believe results in these organizations having to go through transformation or believing that they have to go through transformation so many times within 1 year?
Well, I hate to say this, but it's really pride and prejudice. What happens in too many leaders, in too many organizations, is they leap to an answer and then they stick to that answer even when it's obvious that it's failing. And so they don't like to admit that they were wrong. They feel that admitting that they were wrong will make them look weak. And therefore, particularly for their pet projects, they will say, we're still believing that this is the right answer. We just got to do more of it for a longer period of time. They ignore all of the outside signals from the market that says customers aren't accepting this. We're not seeing the trial rates or the adoption rates or the repurchase rates that we had expected. Our employees know that this isn't working. And so they just continue with things way too long. And when they're finally ready to admit that it's not delivering the results they expected, they tend to blame it on something else other than, well, it was a hypothesis. We tested it, didn't work out. You know, the sooner you can test a hypothesis and say, well, I messed that up. I thought this was going to work for this reason. Turns out that assumption is wrong. The sooner you can do that, the easier it is to laugh about it, get on the right track, and for leaders to set the right example for people on the teams to say, it's okay to have an assumption and admit that it's wrong. As opposed to what we're seeing in way too many technology businesses these days, for example, who are going through a wide variety of transformations where they say, it's not that I was wrong in hiring too many people because I made a bad forecast. I made a bad prediction of what was going to go on in the industry. It's just an uncontrollable industry situation, and now we've got to lay off 20% or 30% of our people. But, you know, what is that phrase? Mistakes were made, but not by me. Mistakes were made by the industry. And so we look to blame other people as opposed to saying, it was a hypothesis, it was wrong, it's my bad. And frankly, I think too often the people that are following the leader's instructions pay the price for following those leaders' instructions rather than the leaders themselves paying some price for making a bad prediction, not testing it along the way, waiting too long, and now we're going to do another transformation. And most people know what transformations mean. It's code for we're going to do layoffs and you're going to have to work harder than you were before. I think it's pride and prejudice that creates the problem.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Based on the failed transformations that I've seen, I can absolutely second that. Now, you decide as an organization how agile you want to be. And even within that organization, not every department, as you mentioned, needs to get to the same level of agility. Now, before we go into the costs of change and pathways to success, you also talk about the importance of metrics, right? This is also how you connect this to the story of Mark Allen. What kind of metrics are your favorite ones? The ones that you believe are interesting to look at for almost every organization? Because especially in the Agile community, there's so much debate. Some people say, forget all the metrics, you don't need any metrics. Some people come up with this quote by apparently Einstein, most things that count or things that count cannot be counted or something like that, right? I'm a big fan of metrics because as a medical doctor, I was trained to look at metrics. But you also need to understand that every metric has its limitation. And if you want to get to a proper diagnosis, it's usually a mix of metrics plus your subjective assessment, right? That results in then a proper diagnosis or initially a hypothesis, which is then again you go and take on a few other tests and analysis and then come up with a diagnosis. So what are the metrics that you look at if you want to assess someone's agility and their transformation towards more agility?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you used a couple of important terms. One is a mix of metrics, which I believe strongly in. In fact, one of the things that I've seen is that organizations that pick a single metric and then set out to maximize that particular metric, I'd say, boy, be careful what you wish for because you will get it. And we've seen time and time again where companies are focused so much on efficiency, for example, that they begin to incur risks. And those risks often turn into major disasters. And we've seen that where companies will pursue cost reduction and they'll sacrifice quality. They'll sacrifice customer safety. They'll sacrifice employee safety, anything to maximize that particular term. And so any organization that I think is trying to maximize a single metric had better be very careful of that metric. The second thing that you said was it's okay for some of those metrics to be subjective. And I agree wholeheartedly with that. I think one of the things that needs to happen is that the metric will signal, something's in a red zone. Something is not working the way we expected it to work. Is it a bad metric? Is it a bad measure of the metric? Is it something we should pay attention to? Just don't ignore it. Don't put black electrical tape over that flashing red light and say, this is annoying me. I don't want to be bothered by it. So I believe in multiple metrics, and I believe that any successful innovation has to create value for its full system of stakeholders. And so by that, I mean, obviously, the first job is you have to create customers that are interested in this innovation. You have to solve an important need for customers. And therefore, there need to be metrics about customers. Are they interested in this? Is this a real problem for them? Are they willing to try it? If they try it, do they like the solution? Do they adopt it? Do they do repeat purchases of it? The second thing you have to understand is, are my employees capable and excited about doing this? Is it consistent with our purpose? Do they believe this is consistent with their own value systems? Do they want to do it? If we can't do everything ourselves, do our suppliers have to collaborate with us? And are we going to work with them in agile ways? Will they share their insights with us? Will we reward them? What about the communities that we're going to operate in? Will they want us in their community, or are we going to be polluting their air and their rivers? Are they going to raise our taxes? Is it going to be a terrible place to work? And of course, it has to meet investor requirements as well. Is the profit, the economic value of what we're doing sufficient to sustain the effort? And for each of those stakeholders, I think it's important to set metrics of how are we doing for them. And every innovation failure that I've seen has seen because at least one of those stakeholders says, nope, not interested in it. The employees quit or go on strike or boycott, whatever it is. And so we need metrics that signals whether the assumptions that we've made for each of those stakeholders when we're submitting our innovation proposal are true, or whether something's wrong and we need to adapt or abandon the project.
And I think taking this perspective that you need to figure out all the stakeholders that you have to do that anyway, right? And have at least one proper metric for each of them, and including the supplier. I mean, I've never done that with suppliers, which isn't. But the reason is, I was just reflecting on this, is that I usually work with teams where everybody was like in that team from that organization. But if you have suppliers, of course, right? It needs to be something where they are also engaged long term, where the incentives are aligned, and you can have a proper metric around that about supplier collaboration. So now we identify metrics, which is probably one of the things on our pathway to success. What are in general the larger costs to making such a change, to making such a transformation? Because the golden mean is about finding the right place where you have the maximum amount of benefits related to the costs, right? That's the place where it makes sense, because if you have more cost than benefit, well, you're losing. Why do that transformation at all? So what are the most important costs to consider?
Well, when you're setting up agile teams, creating agile teams is not easy. For the first thing you have to do is decide, is this a valuable innovation? Is this a valuable product for us to create? And if we're going to do it, either we're going to have to stop something. Every executive I talk to says, look, we don't have a whole lot of extra people just sitting around doing nothing. So if you're going to create a team to do this, and in particular, if you need a focused team, then you're either going to have to stop something else that you're already doing. Now, that may have a benefit, but some of these things may be hard, may have a cost as well, may be hard to stop. Or you're going to have to add additional resources to do this. And if you have to hire additional people, or if you have to figure out where you have holes, that's a cost. Just the team, just running a team has costs. Assembling the team, pulling them off of things they've already worked, developing new capabilities, developing new ways of working, teaching them, going through the training process of teaching them agile ways of working, being willing to take more risks, because you're going to do more testing. When you do an agile team, you are almost certainly going to take more risks and have more mistakes, call it, more failures, more learning opportunities than you had before. That drives a lot of executives crazy. Why did we have to make those mistakes? Why didn't we just know it? Because it was unknowable at the time, because we couldn't predict it. That's a cost. You are going to incur more testing costs, more learning costs. You're probably going to have to set up more prototyping equipment, more prototyping facilities to let people test and learn in a relatively low risk environment. A lot of companies aren't set up to do that. So there's the benefits are huge, but the costs are not insignificant for running agile teams. And you look at a company like SpaceX, for example, and they're blowing up rockets and celebrating the fact that they're blowing up rockets because of what they learned the last time that will make the next time. There are a lot of executives that would say, well, that's inefficient. Yeah, you shouldn't be blowing up rockets. But it turns out it's cheaper and faster than trying to develop something perfect before you launch it. So it just has costs, but it has even greater benefits.
As long as you really take away those learnings. So
Exactly.
if you run an experiment without doing the inspect and adapt, you're just blowing away the money. So,
Well said. So I should tell you, I do have a pet peeve. I do not like the term fail fast because any moron can fail fast, and most morons do, by the way. So the idea is not to fail fast. The idea is to learn fast. The idea is to make your assumptions at the beginning of a project, to make your assumptions very transparent, very obvious to everyone, and say, I'm assuming this, but here's how we're going to test it. And if it turns out to be wrong, we're going to learn, we're going to adapt, we'll change. Here's what we'll do.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I also don't like the term having a culture of failure.
Yeah.
I mean, we have this debate, especially in German companies, because they don't have a culture where they tolerate failure. And then I tell them, I mean, I wouldn't tolerate failure as well. I tolerate failure when it's part of the learning process, right? When you fail at stuff that you couldn't know before, you mentioned the unknowable, and then you learn from it. Still doesn't mean that you now know everything after doing one failure or one mistake, because sometimes, I mean, SpaceX didn't blow up one rocket, they blew up hundreds of rockets. So every time they learned something new. But if you fail to learn, that's when you've really failed. And that's not what I believe any organization should aspire. But having a culture of learning, a culture of experimentation, right? Empiricism, that's what organizations should, from my perspective, strive for. And then I think the costs will be much lower than the benefits they gain from this. Now, looking at this, now we talked about, you identify the level of agility you want to have. And this is different in every organization. You have to run experiments. You have to identify where this natural tension is for you, related to your company strategy, do a cost benefit analysis, all of that clear. You embark on that change. You decide which metrics you want to have. And then you have this pathway to success. Other than the things that I just mentioned, the things that we talked about, what are other important elements of making one of these transformations successful, so that, right, given that people's pride and prejudice is in check, they don't have to go through multiple of these transformations within the same year?
So one of the things that I believe, and I share this with a dear friend of mine, Rita McGrath, is you have to create frequent successes in order to be able to celebrate the things that you're learning and that you're accomplishing. One of the general principles of Agile is that we're going to take big products, big problems, big opportunities, and we're going to break them into smaller pieces, and we're going to test and learn and adapt along the way. One of the things that does is increase the ability to adapt. But another thing that it does is to create frequent successes for the team to celebrate. Even if it's a small success of this test worked, or look at how these customers loved this, or our employees are so much happier. If you're taking the time to recognize and celebrate those successes, It improves the motivation of the team. They can see what they're learning, and they're more excited to pursue the opportunity than ever before. If you're working on something that you have no idea for 3 years whether it's actually working or not, boy, that's tough to sustain. And worst yet, with most traditional innovations, take a look at what they do in their sequencing process. The answer is, in Agile, you take the deal killers, you take the things that are the riskiest things and the highest potential things, and you do those first. Because if it's a deal killer and it's not going to work, you want to find that out early. In a traditional innovation team, that's not the way they work. They start with the easiest things first. And they start with the easiest things first to build momentum. And then after 2.5 years, they start getting to the tough things. And then when they start running into roadblocks, they say, well, what are you going to do? You've already got 2.5 years invested in this. Surely you're not going to stop it now. We've got to keep on going. And so they're building in their full employment aspirations to say, well, we've got to keep going with this at this point. It's a terrible mistake to sequence things so that you're doing the easy things that everybody knew was going to work. You may have spent $100 million on that, but that was never in doubt. It was never at risk. And so we're going to flip that. Do the hardest, do the riskiest things first, and break it into small pieces and celebrate those successes. Say, this assumption is right, or this assumption is dead wrong. We better stop this now and switch it over to something else. Because in the long term, employees are going to be much happier working on something that actually succeeds. You know this about the best employees. You know this about the best software developments. What they want to work on is the cool stuff that changes the business, changes the industry, things they can go out and brag about and say, yeah, I worked on this for such and such company. That's what they want to do.
Things that 100 million users use, and not things that disappear because nobody uses them. Now, you mentioned something that traditional teams or traditional ways of working, they address the small or the easy things, not the risky things first, in order to build momentum. I'm curious because I agree with you. Now, I also use the intention of building momentum as an important aspect of actually making change successful. Because when you have these frequent successes that you rightfully pointed out from my perspective, you also build momentum, right? That's where people are like, yeah, what I'm doing, it's actually having an impact. Right? Or the customer is happy, or the CEO just said this was well done. And this motivates people because, as you mentioned, right? If you're building something, if you're working on something and there's zero feedback, neither good nor bad, and it's just expected from you that you deliver and deliver and deliver and deliver, at some point you're like, why am I doing this in the first place? So the momentum piece, that's my assumption now, is not only something that you would discourage from the old way of working, but also part of the frequent successes. Is that assumption correct?
It is. So I'm a believer in Pareto curves. I'm a believer that 20% of the activities will create 80% of the value in many, many parts of an organization. So what I'm suggesting actually is taking those 20% that we know could have an extraordinary impact on the overall results and working on those, but breaking them into smaller pieces so that I'm working on the most important things, but I've broken them into smaller pieces so that I can create successes, as opposed to working in the 80% of activities that are going to have minimal effects. And even if they succeed, it doesn't much matter. So prioritizing and sequencing backlogs, I think, is very important. But work on the 20% of the things that are going to create 80% of the value, not the 80% that are going to be less
valuable. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, let's use this, Darrell, and jump to chapter 4, Agile Leadership. When I read that title, I had something in mind because I teach Agile leadership courses.
Uh-huh.
So I thought you'd be talking about the stuff that I teach in my Agile leadership courses. And yes, there are aspects of it, but the way you describe Agile leadership, at least my understanding is you and your co-authors, you mean something else. And you start out with the case study, I think, if I remember correctly, of Bosch and a new CEO coming in. Now, what is Agile leadership to you? And why did it become such an important chapter of this book?
I think it's one of the most important chapters in the book, and I have enormous respect for Bosch and for its entire leadership team, actually, because they have a sense, and it's not a popular word in leadership these days, they have the humility to be teachable. They have the humility to continue learning. And so you take a guy like Hank, a very successful leader by most measures, and yet somebody who is willing to seek feedback from a team that says, your leadership style is not consistent with agile ways of working. It's not encouraging us to learn. It's a matter of personal style, but it's discouraging. It's not motivating. To have somebody like that seek the feedback in the first place, believe the feedback in the second place, act on the feedback in the third place, and in the process, improve his own effectiveness, but also his own happiness. That's what Agile leadership is about. Because, and to tell you the truth, I can empathize with Hank because, when I don't know, I've been at Bain 46 years now, and when you become a partner, I believed that I could do every task for every team member better than they could. I thought I could do the associate consultant's job, the consultant's job, the manager's job. I knew how to do those jobs, and I could probably do it better than they did.
That's what we refer to as an expert leader.
It's unfortunately, it wasn't working altogether that well. And part of the reason for that was if you looked at my time allocation, I was spending almost no time on the things that only I could do. That if I didn't do them, it wouldn't get done by the team. And I wasn't doing them because it wasn't comfortable for me. I didn't know how to do them. I didn't see the value in doing that. But I really had to learn a new set of capabilities. And I had to learn that my job was to make my team members more effective and to do the things that only I could do. And so I developed 3 questions that changed my leadership style. One is I always asked team members, what do you recommend? What do you think the solution to this problem is? And at first, I will say I surprised a lot of team members and they didn't come prepared to answer that question. They said, well, you're the one that always tells us what to do. What do you mean? What do you want my recommendation for? Because you're closer to the issue than I am. You know the client, you know the situation better than I do. What do you recommend? And we would often dismiss the team and say, come back when you've got a set of recommendations. They started coming back with better recommendations. Then the second question, how could we test that? That's a very interesting idea. How could we test that? And then I worked with them to develop ways to break down the problem develop hypotheses, develop tests to do it. And then the third question, what do you need from me in order to be able to succeed? And interestingly enough, often the answer was, I don't think we need anything from you. And I got to tell you, that's a little humbling at first to have somebody say, no, I got it from here. But over time, I learned some important lessons. One is when they were making the recommendations, they were far more committed to the success of those recommendations than when I was doing it. If I was just telling them what to do, even if they didn't agree, they'd say, well, fine, I'll just do what he tells me to do. And if it doesn't work, I just come back and say, yeah, you were wrong. But when it's their recommendations, and the difference between success and failure is a little bit of extra commitment to testing and learning, they're more committed to making that work. And second of all, I learned that they were often much better at doing that than I was. Much better. And that was hard as well, to just admit that they are closer to this work than I am. They know the situation. They know the clients. They know what's required. They were just better at it than I was. And I'll admit that there were plenty of times where I said, this is a little scary to me, but okay, we'll give it a go. Let's test it. And then over time, I just learned, no, the results are better when they're doing it than when I'm doing it. And then it finally allowed me to spend time on the things that only I could do, spending more time with senior executives, spending more time changing behaviors, things that they just didn't have the experience writing books to do. So my assessment of what makes a great leader has changed substantially as a result of adopting Agile in my own ways of working.
Yeah. Now, there's a lot of overlap to what I usually teach. And I just want to add something as you were talking about your time at Bain. I mean, you're still there. When I was there briefly for about 3 years. And I still remember on one of my first projects, I was a first-year consultant. But because I had gone to medical school, I started as a consultant. And I didn't go through the associate consultant role. So a lot of the things that were expected from other consultants, I had no idea what to do. So on this one project, I was working with my manager back then, Christian Mazzi. He later became a partner, and then he left Bain to be a CEO at a company. And I remember I was in a taxi with Christian, and I presented him some data, and I'm like, so Christian, now, what do we do? And he looked at me, he's like, you tell me. I'm like, what? He's like, you just presented everything, right? You're the thought leader on this. I'm just your sparring partner. I was like, what? Like, he's just my sparring. He's the manager on the case. He has the accountability. Ultimately, it will be his head if the things are not working well. But he's like, no, Sohrab, I expect you to take the thought leadership on this. And thought leadership also meant that you own this topic. The stream that is given to you, you own it. Doesn't mean that you're left alone, right? That's where the manager comes in or the partner comes in, depending on how high you are in the organization. But that was a crucial lesson for me. And ever since then, when I was in a leadership position the first time myself, I was like, right, so this is your area. You're supposed to be a thought leader. If you're running this pitch with a client or working on this RFP, your job. Pull me in whenever you need me, but that's yours. But I also realized, now I compare this always to shoeboxes, right? Every leader is standing in so many shoeboxes. And as long as you're standing in those shoeboxes yourself, nobody else can step in. And most people don't want to tip on your toes, so they don't step in. Very rarely someone comes in and says, Darrell, you out of that shoebox because I want to step in, right? Sometimes it happens, very rarely. But once you step out of those shoeboxes, and you mentioned it really well, it's scary because you don't know if somebody else can fill that shoebox, can take over that responsibility the way you have done. But two things happen based on my experience, and it's very similar to what you mentioned. A, somebody steps in and they do an even better job than you. And even if not, you realize, okay, what kind of gaps do they have? And usually those gaps are things that you can close by teaching, by coaching them. But once you're out of one shoebox, it gives you the capacity to step into a shoebox that is currently empty, right? Writing the book for you, right? Or meeting with a senior executive, or working on a new innovation project, or doing X, Y, and Z, right? And it's rarely that you then, oh, now I have time off for myself. But especially for senior leaders in organizations, there's so much stuff that they at some point say, we got to work on this. But they never do, because they're so drowned in the daily operation, standing in those shoeboxes where other people that have similar qualifications could take over the job. And to this day, I mean, I've been practicing these things for over 10 years, but still, every time I step out of a certain shoebox, I'm nervous. And every time I step out of a certain shoebox, I realize there are so many other shoeboxes where I could step in. And then it becomes a deliberate process, a careful selection. Which one do I take on next? And now I've made a habit of it. The day I step into a new shoebox, I ask myself immediately, how long do you want to be in that shoebox? Mm-hmm. And what is it that you have to do that you can't step out at some point? Now, in some shoeboxes, I just stay because I enjoy them so much, right? Like running these interviews. And I believe, I mean, you mentioned at the beginning, you need to be having fun at work. So I also cut myself some slack and say, hey, it's okay if you continue doing that. It's creating value for the organization and you're having fun. So 2 boxes checked, but still I evaluate, is there something more important? And is there something where I could have more fun? And if the answer is both yes, then I also need to step out of some of the shoeboxes that I have incredible fun in and that are already valuable. But I think that's an exercise that leaders need to continuously go through. Now, you've been at this game way longer than I. Does that resonate with you, Darrell?
Oh, it very much resonates with me. The only thing that is sobering is that Christian and you learned these lessons so much faster and better than I did. But, you know, when I'm teaching executives to be more agile, I think one of the barriers, one of the hurdles is they feel like they're stepping away from their responsibilities by delegating, by giving more authority to team members. And it feels irresponsible to them. And it feels like you're telling me to just blindly trust people that may not have earned that trust. And I usually have to say, no, I am not asking you to blindly trust anyone. What I'm asking you to build is trustworthy people. Your job is to develop trustworthy people. And in the same way that when I was a parent and I was trying to help my children learn how to drive, I didn't give them the car keys to head from Boston to Los Angeles and say, have a great time. We drove around town and we parallel parked, and they learned, and as they gained confidence, I gave them more latitude. And so I was building, and frankly, this was a lesson I learned as a parent, because when I was a new parent, I thought my job was to build obedient children. And it wasn't long before I realized, oh, that is dead wrong. My job as a parent is to build adults who are going to be better adults and parents than I am. That's my job. I'm not building obedient children. And I'm same with employees. I'm not building obedient employees. I'm building a next generation of managers and leaders who will be better than I am. And I can tell you that when you do that, employees will come to you sooner with problems, because if they feel like I bring a problem to Darrell and I'm going to get yelled at, I'm going to get in trouble, I could get fired, they're going to hide problems from you as long as they possibly can. If, on the other hand, they have a problem and they come to you quickly and they feel like you're on my side, you're in my boat, you're not yelling at me from the shore to row faster, you're in the boat with me, we're going to do some joint problem solving, then they come to you quickly before it becomes a major problem, and you together work through it and say, this is going to be great. And for me personally, I will say that the most fulfilling discussions that I have, some of the happiest times that I have as a partner, is when alumni or clients will come to me and say, some of the best times in my career were the times when we were working together, because I was better when I was working with you. It warms your heart. You say, that's what it's about.
Yeah, that's what it's about. I don't know to what extent you, Darrell, as an American, follow European soccer or European football. There is this great coach, Jurgen Klopp, at Liverpool FC.
Yes.
And Jurgen famously, in a recent interview, he said, other managers collect trophies, I collect relationships. And I think that pretty much sums it up. And when you see how he embraces the young players, how he motivates them, how much confidence he gives them and puts them into situations that could be very, very challenging, but then those really, really young players excel and succeed. I think that's the story that you just shared reminded me of that quote. Now, the question that I have for you, I mean, the fact that a manager, a leader in an organization, needs to become more of a mentor, a teacher, a coach, whatever term we want to use. That's not new, right? Peter Drucker wrote about that. I mean, Andy Grove, in his book, High Output Management, dedicates a whole chapter to why training is the boss's job. But last time I checked, and I also looked at some of the data that Bain had presented on this, very few leaders spend a portion of their time being a teacher, a mentor, a coach. How do we raise their awareness to take on that responsibility? Because going back to what you mentioned earlier, like as a leader, you have to identify what is it that you can uniquely do. And I think qualifying others to become better at their jobs or at certain aspects of their jobs, grow, is an important step. And in many professions, I mean, certainly the first profession that I had in medicine, that was the main job of any attending physicians. With senior pilots, it's the same thing. They know they are measured, they are judged by how they create the next generation of doctors, of pilots, of whatever. But in management, that's rarely the case. How do you look at that?
Well, first of all, I agree with you that it's not a new idea. And I've come to believe over time there is very little new under the sun, that most of what we need to do is known. We just need to develop habits for doing it. And honestly, that's true of a lot of things. It's true of our personal health. Most people know that if we wanted to improve our health, we should improve our exercise and our diet and our sleep and our stress levels. That's not new. Too many of us don't develop the habits for doing it. Or in religion, why is it that we need to go back and reread things that were written 2,000 years ago? And it's just learning how to build these habits into our daily lives. I think too many organizations fail to properly reward some of the skills that we're talking about. And so often the people that develop it for reasons other than for financial rewards. They do it because they have personal values, they have personal purposes. They've learned through experience that this is what makes them happy. The sad truth is humans are brilliant. We have very high IQs. We are not good at understanding what will make us happy in the long term. We're just not. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that. And so we pursue things that bring short term kicks, short term hits, short term rewards, but they don't build the long term fulfillment or joy or eudaimonia, whatever you want to call it, the long term fulfillment that we as humans seek. And so when I'm working with executives on how to do this, I'm just trying to show them how much fun it can be by changing their daily habits, changing the way they allocate their time. We'll look at their calendars and say, look how much time you're spending in operating reviews, basically telling people what they're doing wrong. You're not taking time to think about strategy. Look at your calendar. Look how little time you're spending developing people. So let's just look at your time allocation. And then we'll do joint meetings together. I'll watch them in their behaviors, or I'll give them feedback mechanisms so that their subordinates give them feedback on, I've noticed you're getting better at doing this. It makes a difference. Thank you. Let them experience those frequent successes, those joys of managing, of leading in a different way. It doesn't really take long to say, this is better. I'm less stressed. I'm happier. The teams are better. Why in the world didn't I do this earlier?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the calendar test is absolutely the right one to do. You mentioned Rita McGrath earlier. I also ran an interview with her, and she has that famous, Alex Osterwalder calls it the Rita McGrath test. What percentage of their time is the CEO spending on innovation? And that shows you whether the organization is serious about innovation or not. And I think you can take the same test, what percentage of their time are leaders spending on developing people? And that shows you how serious they are with regards to the topic of growth mindset, which is basically the foundation of empiricism and thus agility. Now, Darrell, with that said, we're at the end of our time box today. I'm really happy that we covered chapters 3 and 4, right? What level of agility do you need? And the topic of agile leadership. Next time we get together, let me have a look. We'll probably be speaking about more technical things. So agile planning, budgeting, reviewing, the organizational structure and people management. And I must say this before we depart, at some of the clients that I help with regards to people management, I have introduced tools and techniques that I've learned at my time or during my time at Bain. But maybe you can share more about that the next time we meet. So I wanted to use this opportunity to thank you again for this really joyful conversation. I for sure was having fun. So very much looking forward to the next conversation, Darrell. Thank you.
Always an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.